looking over the infotome again as I made my way through the hedge maze that separated the entry of this plane of reality and the grand halls in which my uncle could be found. I took note of when and how this intruder had breached one of the most secure facilities in the realms, and once more confirmed the method and timing as well as the spoils of this breach. This intruder was fast, very skilled, and was able to leave no trace. No marks as to any surface being touched, not even prints upon the floor. Only the absence of a small item had even marked the event. The egress and egress from the location had to have been a masterful use of teleportation magics or the like, as there would have only been the smallest of openings, if any, in the security that we had in place. But no security is perfect, no vault impenetrable, and thus this intruder was able to make their way in, take their prize, and leave. All without a single clue being left. It was an impressive deed, and the findings I had been able to gather about it made it clear in their conclusion. This issue required my uncle's expertise, and I wasn't one to delay. Exiting the maze and crossing the vast lawn between it and the hall itself with long, purpose-driven strides, I soon found myself climbing its perfect marble stairs at the same intense pace. Now, normally my uncle would not be found here. However, matters of social import required his presence here at this time. That is, if he wanted to keep my aunt pleased, that was. I still never failed to be awed with the grandeur of my matriarch's hall. It had to be one of the most beautiful places that existed within the realms. These vast, tall halls, all filled with the finest examples of architecture and artwork from across the ages of the realms, and it always held some new marvel each time I visited. As I reached the large doors that led to the tea room, I slowed and came to a stop, considering my next actions. Just barging in would only serve to anger the wrong people who were on the other side of these opulent doors. However, as if in response to my own arrival, the door opened, and my uncle stepped out, who allowed the door to close behind him, cutting out the sound of laughter of his wife and the matriarch in the room behind him. "My apologies, Uncle, but there has been a breach," I began, and his jovial demeanor shifted ever so slightly to his serious, intense one. "What was the nature of the breach? Any idea of the goal, or the nature of the perpetrator?" I handed him the infotome. "That is everything I was able to gather, Uncle. Only thing missing was a fiddle box." That brought his gaze back up to me from the tome. "I assume you did your due diligence in regards to that fact." "Of course, Uncle, and that is what's brought me to you. Seems to have been a comm box of one of yours, one of the House Advanced Division. Or at least is a former member thereof. The file does not have many details and is unclear." I swallowed hard and took a moment to consider how to broach a subject that I had been avoiding for a very long time. My uncle chose then to ease the burden of the action I was considering. "Yes, and you never inquired about us or our operations, have you? Indeed, you have not, to my knowledge at least, ever made any edict or acknowledgement of us at all, which has always been very appreciated, nephew." There was a coy grin on his face as he began to walk. "Come on, I know a place we can talk. I know you have questions, and I'll answer what's relevant to our current issue. He waggled the infotome to emphasize where he felt the focus needed to remain. The rest? That can come later. My thanks, Uncle. Mom told me that was perhaps the only set of affairs in the entire set that I was never to interfere in without your invitation or blessing. If I valued my neck, at least. A look of exasperation flickered across his face, followed by a sentimental, warm smile for just a flash. I continued. And you are of course right, Uncle. There is the more important issue of the breach itself, and what our response will be. He stopped at that. Response? Sometimes I forget that, despite being a fine lord and perhaps even better than I for the duties of state and rulership, you are not the master of clandine mischievousness that your mother is. Praise be her throne for that. He laughed for a moment before looking at me seriously. We will not be responding. I, on the other hand, may. As we stepped outside and onto a large platform, to which his ship had been moored, he asked me a question. Now, how much do you know about the Shadow Mirror War? By the 9 and 4, welcome once more to the library, where today we're going to be taking a look at the longest, yet least known conflict in the history of the realms, that being the Shadow Mirror War. As I am sure you are more than familiar with at this point, my perceptive patrons, this will be only an introduction and an overview of this massive, ages-spanning conflict. The genesis of this conflict is hard to pin down with exact preciseness, as there is evidence to suggest the actions taken quite early on in time were actually a part of this war. One of the primary points in support of this reading of history is the tainting of both Verisar and Fierstein Skychild's Kriston bodies before they were converted. This would have to have taken place years before the marked beginning of hostilities. Regardless as to the exact flashpoint of the conflict, this war pitted the young and just starting nation of Criterion against a force of what appeared to be more Kristons. These warriors, however, were mindless and wholly consumed with the need to destroy Criterion itself, and then the greater realms. However, as various events occurring at the time progressed, it became clear that these were not just a different celestial version of Kristons, as had been the leading assumption at the time. No. In fact, they were a designedly flawed and corrupted versions of Kristons as a whole. They lack any true soul, or sense of being and individuality, which most likely explains the vast numbers that were capable of being produced in such a short time. As without that nigh unique quality of a soul, they would not require the rare resource of an Onychrist to create each. Numbers that would have made the war's victory over Criterion and the larger realms a foregone conclusion for these forces of mocking parodies of Criterion and her people were produced and presented. However, 3 major events ensured that this would not be the way things went. The first was the sudden and as of yet unexplained loss of the Grand Commander of these foul beings. Now, of course there are many rumors and not a single one of them has any proof to back it. However, the generally accepted answer to this mysterious quandary of history is that the commander, whomever they were, met with their end in some sort of small, acute conflict. But beyond that, none can even near agreement on who it was with, whether it was an internal challenge or the actions of some unwritten hero of the realm. No matter the reason or the actor responsible, the effect was the same. The total loss of precise, gifted leadership that rippled across all levels. Next in the strikes against these attackers was the results of the Battle of the Interlinked Nexus, where the bulk of the frontline, secondary, as well as the reserve forces and leadership of these Corruptons were drawn into a large, massive, and deadly battle, and were mostly destroyed by the combined efforts of not only the Criterion armed forces, but an alliance consisting of nearly every major realms, race, or power of the time. This force was supplemented by the arrival of several of the V's to ensure the realm saw victory in this battle, countering the divine trickery and weaponry of these cursed and damned invaders. While estimates vary, it is thought that roughly 10 to 20% of non-combat forces were able to effect an escape. However, all the central command and control figures were either killed in the battle or in the immediate cleanup afterwards. This leaves the final strike, and would ensure that these escaping forces, no matter how large, would not be able to have the time required to fully enact the contingencies that had surely been laid in place. This was the full defeat of the invading deities known as the Judges, a twisted, alternate parody of the Valors, and their master, Kovacs, an eldritch being of twisted, void-tainted, born might. While this was not directly a part of the war itself, the resulting of the closing acts of this series of battles saw the son of the Criterion family, Verisar Skychild, burn away his own soul, body, and divine spark to enable the foul master of the Judges to be laid vulnerable and consequently killed. It also saw his resurrection by forces most divine as recognition of his great dedication and sacrifice to the realms. Following which saw the formation of the Brutes, Verisar's personal special ops unit chosen from the elite survivors of the Battle of the Interlake, and then the formation of the Criterion House Advanced Division, generally formed from the bulk of the rest of the survivors of the Battle of the Interlink. This force, led by the Brutes, with Verisar in command, the Criterion House Advanced Division was charged with rooting out and destroying the remaining corrupted Crystons. This task would take this war deep into the folds of interplanar transient space, far off from the eyes of any in the home realm, for the most part that is, where locating any one of the unknown number of shipbuilding facilities and war gear refineries, city-sized megaliths floating in the space between space, could take months if not years. However, the Criterion House Advanced Division was undeterred by the needle and haystack nature of this campaign, even if it was made worse by the fact that in less than a decade, any one of these facilities can create and deploy another of its kind. Undeterred, the House Advanced Division has relentlessly prosecuted this war for all the years and all the ages since. The exception to this were events such as the Hollow Siege of Chryshold, an action that saw a force of nearly 500 elite Corrupton warriors invade the very house of the family in the heart of Criterion while they were away at an event in Polaron's Grand Arena, only to find after killing their way into the castle, intent on finding and corrupting the Omnimind itself, that all the doors and passages out of the castle sealed themselves. As the Brutes reported after the action, each of the invaders was either killed or captured in extraordinarily short order, as the trap the family in the Advanced Division had laid closed upon the invaders, and the extracted intelligence from the invaders led to the capture and destruction of more facilities in a shorter period of time than at any point in the conflict up to then. On this war went, and for the grand majority of the time, there was never any clue or indication as to the existence of either the House Advance Division or of the war itself. In fact, the war is considered a secret, and none who are a part of it or aware of it generally speak of it unguarded. Any time that it touched Jamamar, due to the priorities of the attackers, it was always centered on Criterion itself, and thus was a simple matter to contain the knowledge of, as most often it was the result of traps like the one we just went through, and thus secrecy already a factor. Now, one might ask at this point, why did, or does, Criterion wage this war alone? With the reality that Crystons can in fact be infected and corrupted by this enemy, it seems to make very little sense. However, the answer can be summed up in 3 S's: suitability, security, and shame. Shame that they were the template of this weapon against the realms. The fact that these attackers are almost impossible to distinguish from a normal Cryston, even if dissected, have made many fear that the distrust and paranoia these could engender in the allies of Criterion would be devastating to all future relations, and possibly even used as a context to dissolve Criterion. Or worse. Security, in the fact that by the Age of Stars, which also heralds the next major shift in the conflict, the captured facilities, as noted in a previous entry, formed a major and important gear in the economic function of the nation of Criterion, thus allowing the other powers to potentially seize any number of them was not in the best interest of the nation, who needed them as much to maintain the war itself as to better the nation and the greater realms. By maintaining hold of them, the war has become a net gain for the nation, not taking much, if any, in the way of outside resources to maintain, which aids greatly in keeping the whole affair under the rug. And that leaves us with suitability. And, despite the dangers of corruption, Crystons were just the best to fight in the vast and varied invasions of this war, where, for great portions of the battle, the presence of atmosphere or even gravity could be, at best, questionable in its quality, quantity, or even reliability. As a baseline, Crystons are just able to adapt to far more theaters of war, with less reliance on magic to do so than almost any of the other younger races, as well as having an intimate understanding of the foe. It just makes a logical choice. As mentioned, the war went on for some time at this pace. However, the events that changed this were just as paradigm shifting for this conflict as it had been for the rest of Jamamar. That, of course, being the Sky Tear incident. In a flash, most of the Criterion military and the materials that they commanded were gone. It is impossible to overstate the loss. Hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, of combined experience and knowledge were gone. And, while the House Advance Division was by and far completely unaffected by the Sky Tear, their duties separate from the rest of the military, the loss of so many required a massive and immediate reorganization of Criterion's forces. This would obviously necessitate the transfer of large amounts of highly skilled, experienced men and the material they used from the House Advance Division to reconstitute the core of the military. With the state of the Shadowmere conflict at that point, this was an extraordinarily dangerous but unavoidable necessity, and it left the war on very thinly backed, but apparently steady footing. However, worsening the situation was the fact that each new planet or realm discovered in the Age of Stars' early years correspondingly expanded the borders of known interplanar space. While planar space is an infinite plane. The connections that allowed such things as trebuchets and other magics to be able to find one planet or another also were creating a larger and larger area of contact with that infinite space. This also seems to have awakened or garnered the attention of large numbers of the foe, forcing the war to go hotter than at any other point since the beginning of the conflict, to prevent it from spilling over into baseline reality. Understandably, this would see the brutes more active than ever before, seeing the loss and replacement of at least one of its members since the Skytear incident. This would make only the fourth such replacement in the entirety of the brute's existence. These, combined with the massive increase for starships and other products for the Age of Stars, that only these captured and converted facilities could provide in the numbers required by the realms, led to quite a few defensive actions, as the foe seemed to shift to a asset retake and denial priority, attempting to reverse gains made by Criterion in the millennia of the war so far. As these attacks have continued to ramp up, they are far outpacing the ability of the House Advanced Division to counter traditionally. So, Varusar Skychild, son of Karthus, a full war master of Tranus, displayed one of the greatest truths of any war planning within the realms. Generally, there will always be someone better than you at any one thing. When available, you should call upon those experts to ease the solving of a problem. As such, using the fact that while a poor copy of a true void-attuned Christon, these corruptons were still deeply based in the power of void, and therefore tied to its nature. So Varusar sought and received the aid of none other than Nox himself, the god of void. Nox would lend his aid in the removal of these abominations to the force he protected, Void, while leaving the facilities nearly untouched for capture and repurposing. While this obviously has not been an end-all to the war, it has allowed the vastly depleted House Advanced Division forces to effectively continue the war while rebuilding their numbers. Calling upon Nox whenever a target is too stiff for a normal and quick victory, and allowing his command over the very nature of the foe and their constituent parts to settle the matter in his typical, efficient, and final way. Speaking of efficiency, it should be noted that captured facilities do not convert one for one into assets for Criterion. Whether due to the damage dealt in taking them, or the massive amount of refitting required to make them usable afterwards, most of the captured facilities will need vast quantities of repair and larger quantities of material before they can be of use to the realms. Fortunately, the facilities themselves can be recycled to provide these materials, as well as providing the base stock for the products to be manufactured after conversion on a facility is done. On average, for every one facility that is fully converted, as many as 10 to 20 are recycled. Now, many years after the Skytear, Criterion's numbers have finally rebounded to the point where the larger Criterion armed forces are back to their previous strength, and the House Advanced Division is slowly getting there as well. And thus, this war continues to go on deep in that plane between planes, most likely for the rest of time. And with this brief overview of the Shadow Mirror War, I hope you have found a bit better understanding about this little known but massively impactful conflict. As always, I want to thank you for your time and your attention. Now, until you once more find yourself in the library, my perceptive patrons, by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourself and each other. Uncle refilled my glass from a crystalline decanter, smiling as I tried to formulate the response to what he had just said, and sat back just as I was able to find the words. "He did what?" was all I could say. After hearing Uncle break down the broader details of the war and his actions within, and now listening as he described his attempts to replace one of his men that had passed in a rather vicious and terrible battle in rather great detail, my uncle was nothing if not exacting in his requirements and had described the process of going through every single record of every person in the House Advanced Division, attempting to find the perfect candidate, finding him, and bringing him aboard the very ship we were sitting in now, the Daystar, to offer him the promotion. It would have been the greatest of honors, something that was the dream of everybody in the Advanced Division. The man's reaction to my uncle's offer was, well, my uncle had a thin grin on his face as I was trying to make sense of what he had just told me. "You heard me. He turned me down, threatened me, and then informed me that as soon as he got back to his unit station, he'd be sending his resignation directly to the Omnimine. He also made it clear that he had never intended to catch my attention, then or ever again. To be fair, he was nothing if not good to his word. I haven't heard a peep about him since that day. My uncle had repeated what he said, and yet it was just as nonsensical as illogical to me before. My uncle's look, however, was one I had known very well. There was an answer here, but to what question? What he had said had brought up so many. First of all, who says no to Uncle Verisar? Secondly, who in the realms dares to threaten Uncle Verisar? Well, okay. Maybe my mom and maybe the matriarch? But besides it, lastly, who would choose to Wait a second. I looked at my uncle with a understanding gaze. Uncle, was that resignation in any way sent in a fiddle box? A wide smile was my only reply.